Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again. And tonight we're going to talk about Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was more than a sex symbol, she was a symbol for her age, the 1950s. Before her tragic death in 1962, Marilyn Monroe became one of the leading box office attractions of the movie industry in Hollywood. Not only for her good looks, but also for her acting. And she would say that when she was a little girl, she was born in 1926, when she was a little girl in the 1930s and went to the cinema, her inspiration became Mae West and Jean Harlow, two great actresses of the 1930s. Now, here is Mae West in 1933. Now, you'll see a number next to the title of the movie, which is I'm No Angel. And Mae West always portrayed women who were not angels, at least by the definition of the term. Uh, the number you see there, 29, was taken from the top 40 films that starred women from 1915 to 2020, so more than a century. And it's interesting because most of these women films uh, occurred in the 1930s and 1940s, and then again in the 1990s to the early decades of the 21st century, when feminism became a mainstream movement in the US and, of course, in Hollywood as well. Marilyn Monroe liked the toughness of Mae West. Not only was Mae West a great actress, but she also movies she wrote. Uh, Another model for Marilyn Monroe was Jean Harlow. And when we look at the pictures of Marilyn Monroe, we can see some of the features of Jean Harlow. And this was done on purpose. It wasn't just some random correspondence, because Jean Harlow was not only a beautiful woman, but she was also a great actress. And again, she played tough women. Of course, one of the most popular women actresses of the 1930s was Vivian Leigh. You see here with Hattie McDaniel. Now, in Gone with the Wind, uh, Vivian Leigh initially comes across as sort of nice plantation girl with slaves all around her to do her bidding and to do whatever she wanted them to do. Not very bright, but very concerned men and her own beauty. However, as the story unfolds of Gone with the Wind, and this is even more true of the book than of the movie, Scarlett O'Hara, the character Vivian Leigh plays, becomes more of her own woman. In other words, she begins to take control of her own life. And after the Civil War in the movie, she just pushes aside her husband, who has no talent for business or the type of communication necessary to build a company, and she becomes a very successful businesswoman. Uh, of course, that was unusual for the American South in the 1870s, but it was not so unusual in the movies in the late 1930s and 1940s. And this is a point I really want to make. Hollywood, during this era, from the 1930s until the early 1950s, did a very good job of portraying strong women, of women who controlled their destinies. It was only in the 1950s and early 1960s that this image began to decline a bit. And we'll talk about the reasons why and Marilyn Monroe's participation in that process. Now, one of the great movies of women is called The Women, 1939. It's interesting, but there were 150 actors in this movie, 115, and all of them were women. And these women were tough women. As Norma Shear, one of the actresses, her character says, "I've had 2 years to grow claws, mother, jungle red." Uh, and her two colleagues, Joan Crawford and Rosalind Russell, would play significant roles in the movies into the 1950s. And the women portrayed strong women. They really, some of them were really not very nice, but the point was they made their own decisions. And those decisions were based upon what they felt was best for them, not necessarily for a man. There were also comedy roles for women in the movies in the 1930s and 1940s. This one, His Girl Friday, you see here Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. Uh, and the cast is primarily male, but she tries to balance her desires for a home life and for her work as a reporter. And this was a new theme in Hollywood at the time. And she does a very good job. And in fact, she keeps the Cary Grant character online and on point for his work. In other words, if you see the film, it's a funny film, it's a comedy, but she's really the brains of the operation. A more dramatic role went to Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford almost always played strong women. In the movie Mildred Pierce in 1945, she is determined to make a better life for her family by any means necessary. And for a woman to go out and become an entrepreneur, that was not particularly typical in America at the time. And again, I want to stress the point that Hollywood, in many respects, was more advanced in terms of women and perceptions of women and what women could and should do than the rest of the country. In Mildred Pierce, she turns a small baked good business into a chain of restaurants. And she's a formidable presence in the movie. Not always likable, again, but a very strong woman who, like Scarlett O'Hara, creates her own fortune. A little later on, one of Joan Crawford's rivals and colleagues was Betty Davis in the movie All About Eve. It's sort of a comedy, but it has some dramatic moments in it. As one of the critics says, "Fasten your seatbelts." It features a powerhouse of actresses. It is the only film in the history of the Oscars, the Academy Award presentations to the best films and actors of a particular year, to receive four female acting nominees for Betty Davis and Ann Baxter, whom you see here, and as Best Actress, and Celeste Holm and uh, Jane Ritter in the supporting category. Successful women and how women become successful. In other words, it's a focus on women, not as appendages to men, but as individuals who make their own future, who make their own fortune. And finally, The African Queen, a fantastic movie that I really recommend to all of you, with Katharine Hepburn, whom you see here, and Humphrey Bogart. Um, and they're really a great match. And Humphrey Bogart's sort of a tough, as you know, sort of a tough guy as they fight their way through German infested waters during World War II. But Hepburn, who could have been sort of, oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say, she is not the retiring type. She gives Bogey as good as she gets. And she shows her guts and, above all, her intelligence in this movie. Um, all of this is by way of saying that by the early 1950s, there was a tremendous diversity amongst female star images. Um, a few were highly sexualized, but would become more so in the 1950s, as was Marilyn Monroe. You had Debbie Reynolds and Doris Day, who were sort of the wholesome girl next door. And Betty Davis and Joan Crawford were very strong women, as was Katharine Hepburn, while Audrey Hepburn uh, characterized a new breed of female sophistication. But World War II would have a significant impact on Hollywood, and by the 1950s, a significant impact on how women were portrayed on the screen. So let's go back a few years to World War II and see what happened to the American image of women that would generate this transformation on the screen for women in the 1950s. Now, during World War II, of course, with the men mostly off fighting the Germans and the Empire of Japan, uh, women took on roles, took on jobs that they had never done before, not only in the armed services, but also in the factories making war materiel. And this was really a new image for women, women and war. Uh, and it was not only a fact, but it was also promoted in advertisements. But after the war, the expectation was, okay, thank you very much for your service. Thank you very much for supporting the men and our fight against Germany and the Empire of Japan. But get back into the kitchen. Stay out of the workforce. So, what we get after World War II in the early 1950s is this image. And I guarantee you, there weren't many women who were washing dishes, first of all, in a dress, secondly, and smiling about it. But this was the image that uh, American businesses and government wanted to promote. Let's get back to, quote, normal. Let's get back to women being women in the home and men being men outside the home. And in advertisement, almost always women were depicted in the kitchen, not in other circumstances. And you can see here for this advertisement for modern kitchen appliances in the early 1950s. And this next slide, I think, emphasizes the uh, dilemma that women had in the 1950s. This is from the Saturday Evening Post in 1959. The Saturday Evening Post was one of the most popular general magazines in America at that time. And you can see from this, this is a cover of one of the issues. This woman is at a desk. Uh, she's she's working and she's inundated by work. And what is she thinking of? She's thinking of washing the dishes in the kitchen with her husband. And I can tell you that there were very few husbands in the 1950s washing dishes, let alone washing dishes with their wives. So here's the dilemma for women: do I want to work, or do I want to be with my husband in the kitchen? And in the 1950s, the response usually was, I want this. I want to be close to my husband. I don't want to be inundated by work. So that was the idea. So this is the world that Marilyn Monroe grew up in. Grew up in the 1930s at a time when women were making advances as they did in the 1940s. And then in the 1950s, the image of women and what they could and should do began to change. So let's focus for a while on Marilyn Monroe herself. This is Marilyn Monroe when she was 16 years old. Um, she was born in Los Angeles on June the 1st, 1926. This photograph was taken in 1942. So, as I said, she's 16 here. Her name was Norma Jean Mortensen. And this is with her husband, James Darty, in 1942 when she was 16. She got married when she was 16. Now, even in 1942, that was kind of young to be married. But as you can see from the photo, she looks a bit older than 16. She's married to James Darty, and you can see here in his naval uniform until 1946. So that marriage lasted uh, 4 years. Um, like many young women, too, Marilyn Monroe worked in the war industry, and here she is now. I defy anybody, any of you, to say, "Oh yeah, sure, that looks like the Marilyn Monroe I know in the 1950s," but it doesn't. When this photograph was taken, she was 18 years old, and she was working for a company that was making radios and radar for bombers that were making missions in Europe, particularly over Nazi Germany. And this was an advertisement for her company in 1944. So she experienced the work that many women experienced during World War II. Well, when the war was over, because of her work for Radio Plane and the advertisements uh, at Radio Plane, she became known as a model. And here she is in 1946, at the age of 20, modeling bathing suits along the Pacific. And of course, since she was a native of Los Angeles, Hollywood was very close by. So the movie industry took note of this, took note of her fresh looks. And you can see here, she's not really blonde in this. Took note of that, and cast her in her first movie in 1950. It was called Asphalt Jungle. It tells the story of a jewel robbery in a midwestern city, and it's mostly a dramatic role. I know we think when we think of Marilyn Monroe, we think mainly of the comedy roles she played, but her ultimate desire was always to be a great dramatic actress. And if you see her in Asphalt Jungle, you will see that she is quite good as an actress. Her second movie was 2 years later. Uh, Again, a dramatic role in a movie called Clash by Night. Uh, and it features, of course, Marilyn Monroe, and a love triangle between her uh, and uh, this guy here and his girlfriend. So that was a serious dramatic role, but she really did not. And by this time she was blonde, but she really did not generate enough of a box office that the movie roles would come quickly. But she attained some success as a model. And here we have her in a champagne ad. I mean, her name is even included in here, uh, because she was becoming recognized, and she was becoming recognized because uh, the public started to understand, and of course, Hollywood portrayed Marilyn and promoted her in a certain way. The public began to know that she was an orphan, that she was married and divorced at a young age. And Hollywood thought that, hey, we are going to make her vulnerable, particularly vulnerable sexually, on screen, making her more appealing to the audience of the 1950s. As the circumstances of her birth, her youthful trials, and her early marriage were revealed, Marilyn Monroe became all the more provocative as a sexual symbol. And this image of vulnerable sexuality was central to Monroe's popularity in the 1950s, as she became the ultimate female figure in need of protection. Her breakout movie was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And uh, Marilyn Monroe, who embark on an ocean voyage to France. Why? Well, they wanted wealth and romance. And Monroe agreed to marry a wealthy man, uh, because to her, the protection of a man and his money was the only way to be happy. Again, we're shifting our perception of women in the 1950s from what they were in the 1930s and 1940s. Women back in the kitchen, back to domestic chores, and don't mess around with work outside the home or politics or anything like that. Just look pretty. Sexuality. So that the purpose of Marilyn Monroe's overt sexuality was to gain financial protection. That was it. Monroe's portrayal of vulnerable sexuality reinforced the 1950s emphasis on the protection of female sexuality. And this was her breakout role. And shortly thereafter, she this is her here. Um, she starred in How to Marry uh, a Millionaire, and obviously from the title of the movie, you could tell that money was the key uh, to success. And of course, you have to be blonde. Lauren Bacall here was not quite there, but evidently um, close enough. It's interesting, but in the movies of the 1950s, um, male, female stars, women, were so popular that they were either billed before male stars on promotional material, or did not need a male star at all to attract an audience. Uh, Monroe and Russell were the star attractions on the posters for Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And as we'll see in one of her greatest films, Some Like It Hot, that Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, the male leads in that movie, they were just secondary. They really didn't make it on the promotional uh, coverage of uh, the movie. The talents of Marilyn Monroe could carry a film all by herself, and and they knew that people would go to the movies and box office money uh, because Marilyn Monroe was in the movie. So you have these two trends here of making women sort of vulnerable and beautiful, yet at the same time, they are really carrying the movie industry in Hollywood in terms of generating revenue. Well, as a movie star after 1953, Marilyn Monroe became fodder for the tabloids, the newspapers at the time. And in 1954, she married the baseball great Joe DiMaggio. He had retired from the New York Yankees a few years before, but was still one of the great American heroes of baseball, the national pastime. And Marilyn Monroe uh, married him. Uh, Her next major film was in Some Like It Hot. And here's I'm sorry, not Some Like It Hot, The 7-Year Itch, about a man who, as the saying goes, after 7 years of marriage, Men are looking around for other women. Again, this is the 1950s, and it's a very male-dominated decade, and women are more objects than subjects. Very different from the movies of the 1930s and 1940s. And here's the iconic promotional photograph for the film. What Marilyn Monroe is doing is standing on a subway grate in New York City, and subway grates have air coming up from the subway, hot air primarily, and you can see the publicity uh, here. Well, the marriage to Joe DiMaggio did not last very long, and instead, and this surprised everyone, she married the great American playwright Arthur Miller. Now, from a personal point of view, I can tell you that my father and Arthur Miller were roommates at Michigan in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And my father said Arthur Miller was the biggest nerd that he'd ever come across. Of course, he was a great playwright, wonderful playwright. So this really surprised everybody. But I think it underscores Marilyn Monroe's desire to be taken seriously. And if she could be taken seriously by a man who was at the time the greatest American playwright living, then in fact, she would get the roles in Hollywood, and she would get the perception that she had substance. She wasn't the dumb blonde that some of her movies made her out to be. And in fact, her first major film after the marriage to Arthur Miller was Bus Stop. Uh, it was a comedy about a cowboy who's sort of to live on his ranch in Montana against her strong role for Marilyn Monroe. It was different from sort of the retiring and I need protection because, and as you can see here from this screen, she's not really that happy with him, and she's just standing up to him. Um, but perhaps her greatest film was Some Like It Hot, and uh, again a comedy. But and I think this is significant. But by 1959, when this movie appeared, critics were beginning to say, "Hey, you know, Marilyn Monroe is not only beautiful and vulnerable and sexy, but she's a darn good actress." And in this movie, Some Like It Hot, where two musicians, uh, Jack uh, Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis, uh, become the targets of a mafia organization after um, witnessing a murder. In order to survive, they disguise themselves as women and pretend to be in an all female band. Uh, this Some Like It Hot is really a pioneering movie because in the 1950s, cross dressing was not a phenomenon. And if it were, it would be squashed down very, very quickly. But her performance was so good that she won a Golden Globe Award. So a Golden Globe Award for acting. So that in itself underscored her ambition to be taken seriously as an actress. Uh, and it comported with something else that was happening in American society. And this is an important point that I want to make in that um, Hollywood does not exist in a vacuum. What's going on in American society, and we saw this with the homebodies of the early 1950s. What goes on in American society affects also what you see on the silver screen. Now, sometimes, as happened in the 1930s, the movies can push society along a little faster, but most of the time it's uh, one pushes the other, and then the other pushes back, and so on. It's part of American culture. And what was happening in the 1950s is that women were saying, "What the heck with that? I'm going to have a career." And here you see the cover of Life magazine, a career girl. Um, and a woman who's a doctor. My goodness, that now women were doctors in the 1920s and 1930s, but then medical schools just closed their doors after World War II, closed their doors to women. Here was one of the few universities, University of Chicago, that allowed women to study and become doctors, as well as to practice their uh, their craft. But also something else was happening in American society, and we've talked about this before, so I'll just mention it briefly. And that was the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was above all a movement for equality. Yes, understandably, racial equality, but also equality in other areas, particularly equality between women and men, gender uh, equality. And if that was not enough to emphasize that point, in 1962, Betty Friedan, seen here, published her, her book, The Feminine Mystique, which began a new phase of the women's movement. Now, it is interesting when her publisher said, "Okay, Betty, uh, give me a publicity photo so we can, when we promote the book, and people can see what you look like." And this was the photo she sent. Now, what does this photo say to you? It says that, yeah, I'm a feminist. I want women's rights. I want women's equality, but I'm also a mother. And she figured that by showing that this was, of course, a traditional role, society, particularly in the 1950s, that she was not some wild radical, but instead, it was possible to be a mother and also advocate for gender equity and gender equality. And it wasn't only Betty Friedan, it was Rachel Carson, who became a prominent environmental author with her book, again in 1962, of Silent Spring. And women as scientists, that was unheard of. Again, it happened in the 1920s and 1930s, but not after World War II until the late 50s and early 1960s, when she talked about the impact of pesticides on the environment. Few people paid her attention. Why? Because she was a woman. You know, but eventually, the tests that she made, the research that she conducted, became verified and ratified by the general scientific community. And she is really the origin of the environmental movement in the U.S. Now, Marilyn Monroe's final film was The Misfits, and you see here with uh, Clark Gable, her leading man, and it was a comedy. I mean, the title of the movie just lets you know exactly what it is. It was a comedy, and she was very good in it. But her life outside of film, outside of the movies, was crumbling, and not many people knew about that. Her marriages had failed. She was getting older, and in Hollywood, if you're a woman whose looks depend upon the roles you get, getting older is not a good thing. She had no children. Uh, she had no men friends at uh, at the time. Um, Although she was fairly close to the British actor Peter Lawford, but only in a friendly way, not in a uh, romantic way. Uh, and she was lonely. She was not only lonely, but she was concerned about her future uh, as an actress. She desperately wanted to play dramatic roles. She desperately wanted to appear on Broadway in live theater. And those roles were not coming to her. And this idea of vulnerable sexuality was totally opposite to the direction that femininity and feminism was going in the early 1960s with Betty Friedan and the rise of the feminine uh, movement. Uh, so she felt that she was not only out of the mainstream, but she was getting out of time. And in August of 1962, this was the headline of New York newspaper. And it is so typical of the perception of her and women, still women in general in the late 50s, early 60s, that, okay, Marilyn Monroe kills self. Okay, that's pretty stark headline. But look, found nude in bed, hand on phone, took 40 pills. Come on. Is that necessary? Particularly found nude in bed. It sells newspapers, but again, it objectifies women. And Marilyn Monroe was really a symbol for her age, but that age was changing, being left. In 1964, 2 years after her death, Andy Warhol commemorated her and her memory with this painting. I look forward to your questions. Are there any questions? Oh, here's one. Would it have been easier for Marilyn Monroe to build a career in the Me Too era? Do you think she would support this movement or not? Oh, she would definitely support it. She complained about her objectification. She realized that that's basically what made her very wealthy. Uh, but we learn this from the memoir of Arthur Miller, to whom she was married for a relatively brief time. She was quite frustrated about the roles that she got. They were good roles, but she felt that they made her seem almost one dimensional. The vulnerable blonde. She wanted to be more like Mae West, more like Joan Crawford and Betty Davis. And it's interesting, but the careers of Joan Crawford and Betty Davis just crashed, excuse me, in the 1950s because their portrayal of women just didn't correspond to what the American conception of women ought to be during that decade. Any other questions? I heard that Marilyn Monroe supported leftist movements in the US. How did this affect her career? Uh, why did she like leftist movements? Well, it was not unusual for Hollywood to support leftist movements. Arthur Miller, to whom she was married, was called before the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee in the early 1950s. Uh, and of course, my father was called before that committee as well because his address and phone number were in Arthur Miller's address book that they confiscated. But my father was not a communist, but Arthur Miller did uh, involve himself in the party during the 1940s, although not in the 1950s. It was not unusual for most people in Hollywood who were creative people who uh, required the freedom to write and to act as they saw fit. It was not unusual for them to be left. And in fact, an entire segment of the McCarthy hearings into communism in the US in the early 1950s was devoted to Hollywood. And some prominent Hollywood actors and producers and directors came under the scrutiny of that committee. Not Marilyn Monroe, but certainly Arthur Miller and others. But yes, her views were left, definitely. The image of Monroe continues to be repeated and reproduced even in modern mass culture. What do you think made Marilyn Monroe a cultural type? Well, I think first of all, there's several things actually. First, her vulnerability. It's human nature to want to, hey, everything will be okay. You're going to be okay. So, her vulnerability and her beauty certainly played in into that. But I think also her tragic death uh, emphasized the fact she's one of the most beautiful women in the world. Here was one of the wealthiest women in the world. Here was the most loved, one of the most loved women in the world in terms of box office, and yet she was lonely. Yet she lacked something. She did not have the approval of characteristics and talents that thought she should have. And she had failed in several respects, uh, failed in landing more dramatic roles, but failed also in her love life. Her marriages all ended in divorce, and her marriages ended pretty quickly, relatively quickly. So that sense of failure permeated her permeated her more than success. Uh, well, let's wait. It made her want to get the heck out of home as soon as she could. She did not have a good relationship with her parents, and her marriage at 16 reflected that. Um, Throughout her life, she wanted a stable home, and she never really got that, either in her marriages or in her private life. And her relationship with her mother affected her deeply in that regard. What kind of relationship did Marilyn Monroe have with photographers? Did she like photo shoots? Well, early in her career, as I mentioned, she was a model. So modeling and photographs were two in the two in the same. Um, and uh, in Hollywood in those days, in the 1950s in particular, when you signed a contract for a movie, you also signed the contract for publicity. So it was really a requirement, and Marilyn realized this was part of the job, and she resented some of the what we would call cheesecake, that is the exposure of her body, because she felt that this, at least we know from Arthur Miller's writings, she felt that she was being exploited, not for her talent, but for how she looked. Okay, in the context of modern conversations around mental health, how might Marilyn Monroe's struggles with her career and personal life be approached and understood differently today? That's a great question, because I think today, I know today, we are more open about it. Tennis stars, movie stars, musical talents, uh, they're very public about their mental challenges. And when you're public about that, in many ways, it's easier to deal with it because you don't have to hide it. You don't have to suppress it. You don't have to say, "Ooh, what's wrong with me? There's something very wrong with me. I'm not like other people." But the fact is that you are like uh, other people. So I strongly believe that had Marilyn Monroe's career started in the 21st century, she would not have experienced the ultimate despair that she experienced in the early 1960s. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you again, and I wish you the best and look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you.